then go, Joe and Ed, I'm going to hand over to you both.
Thanks, Maddie. So what we're going to be talking about today is, firstly, kind of a little bit of a background and overview on AI, kind of what it is, why we're talking about it, just kind of make sure everyone's on the same page. We want to talk about, what the opportunities are that AI provides, why we think it's something that we do all need to be talking about. Going to talk about some of the kind of risks around AI, things that will need to be considered and kind of the risks that will need to be managed. And then, a good bit for me and Joe is kind of where do human copywriters still fit in? Why are we hopefully still going to have jobs and not just be replaced by AI? We're going to talk a little bit about how Conscious have started using AI, kind of the experiments we're running with it. We're going to give some tips on how to kind of make effective use of AI. We're going to talk a little bit about the strengths and weaknesses of some of the different AI writing tools that we've been looking at. And then, we're going to give an example, as Maddie said, of a piece of AI generated content. And we'll talk through, what we think is good about it, what we think some of the limitations are that people would need to be aware of. And then kind of open it up for discussion of how people are currently using AI.
Great. So just so we're all pretty much on the same page, we're just going to discuss what actually AI writing tools are. I'm sure a lot of people have already started experimenting with using AI because since ChatGPT became a thing, I think everyone tried to jump on the bandwagon all at once. I mean, we aren't clued up on the intricacies and the actual mechanics of AI because obviously that's not what we do, we're writers, but we have a decent understanding of how it can be used to generate content. So common AI tools like ChatGPT, they're essentially language models for creating text. So they do this by using natural language processing. So that analyzes and essentially synthesizes what it deems to be an original piece of text. I can use quotes around original because we'll get into that, whether it is actually original or whether it, duplicates content. It will draw the information from basically anywhere on the internet. So this will usually be a combination of sources with high levels of authority. So think Wikipedia, verified news outlets. But depending on the complexity of the prompt it's given, it could also draw on other sources and combine them into one. So so the text will essentially be original that it creates, but the caveat is it may be pretty similar to the sources it's used to generate that content, especially if the prompts used to generate the content are more generic, essentially.
So, why are we talking about AI? Why does it matter? It's obviously been all over the news. I think everyone's sort of aware how much it's grown and how rapidly in use. And, the one statistic is that ChatGPT claims that they've got over 100 million users worldwide. And obviously we're, kind of really at the dawn of people using these tools. So I think we can expect that to increase substantially. And obviously there are other tools that people might be using as well. So I think it is something that lots of people are using, lots of businesses are starting to use it, lots of agencies are starting to use it. So I think it's something that we do all need to be thinking about. And I think that there are some real potential benefits that, firms, that marketing agencies, that we as copywriters can get from ChatGPT and other AI writing tools. And obviously we'll talk a little bit more about that in detail. But, I think it has the potential to be really, really helpful. But, as we've already touched on, there are risks that need to be considered and carefully managed when using these tools. And that is, again, we'll sort of get into more detail, but, there's risks in terms of potential things like legal risks, but also the risk of whether what you're creating is actually going to do what you want it to do. And as an agency here at Conscious and as copywriters, we see our role in all of this as helping businesses to make sure that they're actually getting the benefits that they want to get out of using AI, while also helping to manage those risks.
Yeah, it would be very easy for us to, as copywriters, to say we shouldn't use AI, we should just use us as human writers. But I think everyone's well aware that the use of AI is happening and it's going to happen and it's just going to continue. So like Ed said, it is about how we manage the existing risks and make sure that you get genuine value from using AI. So kind of on that, there are obviously loads of potential opportunities that AI presents. Again, if you've already started to use it, you're probably aware of some of these benefits. The first being the fact that it's always going to be able to generate content much faster and much more efficiently than a human could. That's just a fact. Even the most experienced writers with decades of experience aren't going to be able to come close to the sheer volume of content that AI could produce. And that's, that's just a fact that you can't really dispute. But it's also important to realize that it's not just a practical tool. So it's something that you can use for idea generation. So if you're struggling for ideas, you're having one of those days where you just can't think of, how you can create a new angle or a new spin on a topic, it can be used to give you some inspiration on a different approach to take, which is, something that's really, really beneficial. I think we know this, and I think Maddie can probably chip in on this as well. It can be a really great tool for helping anyone who isn't necessarily super confident in their own writing ability or doesn't have experience in writing content that is intended for like a more general audience. I think like I said, from Maddie often has to ask people at Conscious to write blogs for our website. And for people that don't do any writing as a part of their job, that can be quite a daunting experience for them and a bit of a chore for Maddie to get them to write the content in the first place. So it's really beneficial for that. And it's a base level thing. I think it's quite easy to work off of. It's quite accessible. An important factor to remember as well is that the base level versions of most AI tools are free. So anyone can use them. There's going to be no direct costs in that sense. And, because it's an AI, because it's a computer, we essentially remove the overhanging risk of human error that can happen in content. Ed and I are writers, so we like to think this isn't so much of an issue for us. But it's a fact of life that sometimes tiny errors can slip through the cracks. AI should, in theory, remove that issue from being a thing. And we'll discuss this a bit more as we go on, but it's crucial now to use it to stay competitive, because it's no secret that everyone is using it to some degree or another. So essentially it's now or never to get involved and start getting used to the way you want to use it and how it can work for your firm in the best way.
But while there are lots of opportunities, and I think, as Joe says, I think we all are going to have to use AI if we want to stay competitive, because other people are going to be using it. I think it is important to think about what the risks are, what the things are that we need to be aware of in the way we are using it. And one of the big ones that I think people have probably all heard of is that you can't necessarily guarantee that the information is going to be accurate. AI can make up answers if it can't find the right information. People refer to it as hallucinating, where it will just start generating stuff that's kind of nonsense because it can't actually find a good answer.
Yeah.
So I think it is important that you actually have someone who understands the subject, reviewing it and making sure that it is correct. And the other thing is that the information won't necessarily be up to date. So again, something people may be aware of with ChatGPT, it was trained on a big set of data from September 2021. And so it doesn't know anything from beyond that. So for example, it doesn't know about no fault divorce. So if you were getting it to write divorce content, it would, the information around the divorce process would be out of date. So again, this is really important to not just rely on what it's generating and kind of assume that that's correct. It will all need to be checked. For law firms, it will still need to be checked by a lawyer, I would think, really, before you put it up. And the information that it generates won't be unique. And so what I mean by that is, in theory, it should be uniquely worded. So it shouldn't be the same wording as any other content that's out there. Although there's sort of questions about how true that is. And I think there are examples of it pulling some quite big chunks of text from the sources. But what I mean by the information won't be unique is essentially the information is just going to be whatever was in the data set. So if you're writing a page about divorce, if someone else is writing a page about divorce, you're both using AI, you're both essentially going to potentially have exactly the same information. So I think you need to think about what potential value you can add beyond what someone else using the same tool to write about the same subject would have. What of your own experience, what about your own firm can you put into it to make the information unique? And yeah, on the same thing, the content won't be personal to you or your business. Now, you can, with some of these tools, train them with content about your business, so they can to some extent start to learn about your business and your tone of voice. But how effective that is, I think is debatable. And with these tools, they tend to have a certain amount of time that they will remember content you've put into them for, and after a while it sort of forgets the content you've put in. So even if you do train it, that training is not necessarily going to last forever. And again, the information in there won't be unique or personal to your business unless you give it that information. The other thing that is very much a live issue at the moment that I'm sure you're probably lots of you are aware of is around copyright. And there have started to be some legal cases, particularly around AI generated art, and whether it's infringing the copyright of the sources that have been used to generate that. I haven't so far heard of any cases around text-based content, but I suspect that will happen. Whether those people have a case, whether that will go anywhere, how long that might take before it goes anywhere, obviously hard to know, but it is something to kind of be aware of, that is a potential issue. And I think it's really important, if you are generating AI content, that you are running it through some kind of plagiarism checker like Copyscape or like Grammarly, to make sure that there aren't kind of big chunks of it that are too similar to existing sources. And then I think, a big part of where we as a marketing agency and where we as copywriters fit into this is that the stuff that AI produces, isn't necessarily going to be effective in terms of search engine optimization. What it produces by itself will not necessarily help you to appear higher in, Google rankings, other search engine rankings. And I think that's particularly likely to be an issue if lots of people are generating AI content around a subject. If that's all you've done is just produce kind of like the bare minimum using AI, and 100 other firms have also done that, your chances of actually ranking well in search results with that content, I think, are probably quite low. So I think you would need to think about again, what are you going to do to make that content better than the competition? Another thing to think about is how user-friendly the content is going to be. I think what's good with these tools is I think the language they use is quite accessible. So I think they're user-friendly from the point of view of being relatively easy to read. But I think it's also thinking about, your target audience. What level are they expecting to be spoken to at? And that's partly around tone of voice, but also, what information can you expect them to already know? You don't want to be pitching the content too high and not explaining the basics. But if, say, you've got a more sophisticated audience, you don't want to be necessarily explaining all of the basics, because they might find that sort of patronizing and uninteresting because you're just telling them stuff they already know. So I think there's lots of thought that has to probably go into who your target audience are and whether the content is going to be appropriate to them. And then also in terms of how it's structured, like, is it easy for them to jump to the information they want? I think, I don't think AI content that I've seen actually is the worst in terms of structure. It tends to use things like subheadings and like shorter paragraphs that makes it more scannable, which I think is quite important now because people aren't necessarily going to sit and read the whole thing. But I think it's just making sure that you're kind of providing the best user experience.
Yeah, I think in terms of that, in terms of format, it will always tend to follow a very logical format. And it will be very easy to follow, but it might not be the most optimal format for whatever you want the audience to do. So if you're selling a service or you want them to take a certain action, it might not follow the most effective structure for achieving that goal. And that's not something that it will be able to do by itself. Someone's going to have to intervene to change the format quite heavily.
Yeah, and I think, and as I said, if everyone uses it, the content that it produces is going to have less value. And so I think that's just really important to think about, is you're still going to have to do something to make your content stand out.
Yeah. And that kind of, in a way, contradicts the idea of, although it's a time-saving tool, using AI to generate content, you're still going to have to spend a lot of time and resources into actually making content, as optimal as possible. If you generate something, there's a lot of steps that still need to be taken before you can actually, you can be happy with uploading something to your website that AI has actually produced. So there are obviously, as we've said, using AI now is kind of essential, or at least experimenting with AI or getting to grips with AI, because, you're likely to fall behind the curve if you don't start now. It's a simple fact that ChatGPT has been out for almost half a year now, so a lot of people have half a year of experience in using it and adjusting the way they use it to be as effective as possible. Because of the way that it can generate content quicker and help you generate ideas, if you're not using it now, it could mean that you're not necessarily using your time or your budget as effectively as you might otherwise. So that could be, internal to your business or external if you ever, look to outsource any work. Or the other risk of not using AI is if you work with someone who isn't necessarily an expert in writing content. So as an example, we write strictly legal content, so we would consider ourselves to be experts in that field. But if you're speaking to someone who isn't necessarily has that specialism, you run the risk of that content being inaccurate or ineffective. And in theory, that shouldn't be so much of an issue with AI because of the source it's generating.
So I think, in terms of evaluating whether AI is going to be effective, I think it's really important to think about what good content for your website actually looks like. And so from our point of view, there's two sides to it really, which is, does the content kind of match the needs of your target clients? Do the sort of people that you want to attract, are they going to find that content in the first place because, you know, it's got the SEO factors you need. When they found it, is it actually giving them the information that they need? You know, something that we have seen a lot in the past is content that is just kind of explaining the law, often in quite a dry way. And that's not necessarily what someone needs to see in order to make the decision to contact you. You know, it's often useful to include content explaining some of the law in the form of FAQs, in particular, partly because that's helpful. People might want that information, but also because that helps with search results. But I think it's really important to think about what information does someone actually need in order to go, oh, you know what, these are the people for me. I'll pick up the phone to them. I'll send them an email. And I think that is something that, you know, at the moment, certainly at least, still needs a person to be thinking about. And, you know, the way we do that is it tends to be us working with the law firm to kind of understand the clients. And obviously, you know, because as Joe says, we write exclusively legal content. For a lot of subject areas, I think we've got a pretty good handle now on what a typical person wants to know in order to make a kind of buying decision about a service. And also, you know, is it giving that information in a way that's easy to absorb? As we sort of touched on, you know, is it structured well? Is it pitched at the right level for the target audience? And yeah, does it have those SEO factors so that they're going to find it in the first place? And the other thing that the content needs to do is match the needs of your business. So does it actually accurately describe your services? You know, there's a certain degree to which some of these services tend to be quite similar from firm to firm, but, you know, your focus might be slightly different. The specific matters you're most keen to help people with might be a little bit different. You know, you may have certain expertise that other firms don't. And so I think, again, that's something that your content really needs to get across. You know, what can you actually help people with and what do you want to help them with? It needs to clearly identify, you know, your USPs, you know, why they should pick you. It needs to correctly represent your brand, you know, your values, your tone of voice, you know, the people that work for you. And, you know, and all of those things, I think, are things that can only really come from you. You know, an AI isn't going to know that unless you give it all of that information. And yeah, I think, you know, a really big part of what we look at is making sure that content clearly shows the target clients that you're the right firm for them and maximizes the likelihood of them choosing to contact you. You know, we talk about conversion rate optimization and what can we do to make the best chance that someone who lands on the page, reads the page, is actually then going to contact you and become a client. And so that's really the things that we think good content needs to do. Is it needs to work for your clients and it needs to work for your business.
So can AI produce good content? Yes, it definitely can, but with that big sort of asterisk that it needs to be used by the right people and people that essentially know what they're doing. So this means anyone that has like a comprehensive understanding of the way digital content works, the way copywriting works, the way marketing in general works, because you always need the content you produce to tie in closely with the services you provide and how best to connect with your target audience. So in every case, you know, crafting good, effective website content is hard. You know, it's not a simple process. It's not an easy process. So the idea of having an entire website with all the content produced strictly by AI without any kind of, you know, human intervention is something we're nowhere near actually achieving, I don't think. So whenever you produce any type of content, you know, if it's through AI or not through AI, loads of research needs to be conducted first. So that's, you know, focusing on the areas that you're specifically targeting, your target audience. That's the case, whether that's using AI or not using AI. When you want to engage with an AI tool, it could mean having to spend the time to write out a detailed content spec first. So that means, the SEO keywords you want to focus on, the structure you want to focus on, the tone of voice that you want. It's not going to be, AI is not going to be able to do these things without you spending the time, putting the effort in first to give it as much information as you need. That sort of leads into then the way you use prompts and the way you actually get information from AI. You really need to spend a lot of time carefully crafting the prompts you want to ensure you're getting out exactly what you want. We're going to touch on prompts a bit more in detail later on, but that's something a lot of people question, and a lot of people don't really know how to go about, because it can be a case of putting in a very simple prompt, getting a piece of content that isn't exactly what you're looking for, but then you don't really know what to do next to tailor that content a bit better. In every case, we've discussed this, previously, but whatever AI generates, someone is always going to have to review it. You can't ever exactly trust that what it's going to produce is going to be timely, it's going to be accurate, it's going to be strictly discussing, for example, UK law. There might be an example where it drags in something from America or somewhere else. So that, also means that you're going to have to spend a lot of time fact checking. And like we've said earlier, especially with ChatGPT, the fact that it only goes up to September 2021, that means that content could essentially be out of date. So like Ed mentioned earlier, no fault divorce is a great example. That was one of obviously the biggest changes we've had in terms of legislation in the past few years. And you could have an entire blog that is essentially completely wrong and completely misleading if you don't spend the time to actually fact check. I think what we would agree now, that using AI is never going to be a case of just entering in a really simple prompt, copy and pasting the results you get, and then uploading it straight to your website. There are always going to be a lot of other steps involved, which thankfully for me and Ed means there's always going to be a place for humans, essentially. We hope anyway, because, although AI definitely does speed up the general process in terms of creating content, I don't think it's any sort of replacement for a marketing team you have, or any specialists within a marketing team, like copywriters, for example.
Yeah, and so, the question for us, and I think, again, is sort of, justifying why hopefully we will continue to have a career, is where do human writers fit in? Where do human content experts fit in if AI can do the writing? And I think that for us, it's, a lot of the stuff we've already touched on around kind of checking the quality, checking the accuracy, we can help with that. Getting to know these tools and how they work. And so making sure that we can be using them in a way that produces the best results. So, we talked about the prompts, and it would be, understanding what is an effective prompt. If you're feeding in previous content from a client, what's the best way to do that to get the best output? So I think that's going to be a big part of our role, will be being the people who understand what you need to put in to get out the best results, and then being the people who are reviewing the results to make sure that they're going to be effective and that they're accurate. And I think where we can really add some value is around understanding the firms that we are producing content for. So, making sure that we understand the tone of voice, we understand the types of services that a firm wants to focus on, we understand the types of clients that they want to target, and make sure that the content is, that the end product with the content is going to work for those type of clients. So I think that's a big part of what the human element will be. I think it is making sure that what is produced is not generic, but is specific to your firms. It's also about making sure that the content is consistent. And as we say, obviously you can feed contextual information that kind of should help it to understand a brand, but you can't 100% guarantee that that's always going to be effective. And because it does forget older content that it's been fed over time, there's a potential for it to drift from what it was doing for earlier pieces of content. So I think a big part of our role would be helping to keep content consistent with the brand voice, consistent with the way a firm wants to present itself over time. I think it's also going to be about, a lot of what we do currently, making sure that the content actually works effectively for search engines, for user experience, and for driving conversions. I think there's stuff you can probably do in terms of the way you write the prompts to help with that, to help with it adding that stuff in itself. I think it's probably only going to get better at doing that over time, but I think there is still always going to need to be a human element of like checking and optimizing that and making sure it's working the absolute best that it can. And also, once a piece of content's up, checking how it's performing and then possibly making further adjustments. And I think where, again, I think we can add a lot of value is in the kind of the gaps that I think AI has. So I think you have to be really careful with the way questions are worded that you put to AI, as it may not understand them, may not be able to answer them. And as we talked about before, if it can't answer them, it has a tendency to just make up answers. And a big issue that everyone's going to have to get to grips with is that these tools store the data that you put into them. And so there's a big question around confidentiality of information there. So there was one firm that was talking about, could they just stick in case notes and generate a case study? And I think that's the sort of thing you'd have to be incredibly careful with, because you couldn't put in, or I wouldn't feel comfortable putting into one of these tools any sensitive information. And so I think that's a really critical issue that I think everyone's going to have to think about.
Yeah, so to building on that, I think, as you probably have established by now, our sort of thoughts are you can't solely rely on AI generated content just yet. There are still a lot of essential steps that need to take place before you can actually use a piece of AI generated content on your website and be confident that it's going to deliver effective results or reflect your intended tone of voice, appeal to your target audience. Everything needs to be thoroughly checked. So whether that's fact checking, the tone, the structure. In some cases, it could generate a piece of content which you think is broadly good, and it answers the prompt that you've provided, but you might need to still spend time just completely revising entire sections that you don't think fit, could be out of date. The legislation included could be wrong. There's a lot that still needs to go into the creation process when you're using AI with your content. We sort of touched on this earlier with regards to the potential issues surrounding copyright, but I think this bleeds into the idea of reputational damage if you're relying too heavily on AI content. So that could be because another website in theory has an issue with you potentially lifting the AI lifting content and then including it on your site. But I suppose there is a potential issue with someone maybe feeling misled by the fact that they were sold a service or sold you as a brand when it was AI generated content. So you potentially walk in a tightrope without having some sort of form of human intervention as the process goes along and you get to uploading content. And we've mentioned this before, but it's good to reiterate. AI generated content right now won't really help you stand out in any way, at least without a lot of, editing and revision. Without any extra input, you're going to have the same piece of content as someone else who's provided a very similar prompt. So we have an example blog later on in the presentation surrounding wheels. So if you were generating a blog about, top tips for writing a wheel, or why should I write a wheel, that's a common, topic that someone else is likely to think of. And you're both going to end up with a very similar piece of content that isn't going to necessarily help you stand out from the crowd. So if everyone does it, there's going to be a sort of severe lack of personality in your content, which is essential.
Yeah, and I think on that, the personality side of it, I think is really important, because the way we approach it is that the content on your website should sound like you. It should represent the way you're going to actually speak to clients when they get through to you. It's sort of the start of the conversation.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important to think about that issue of, is it representing you? Is it representing your brand, the way that you actually would speak to people and the way you actually want to come across?
Yeah, because that ties in, because I think when we speak to clients for the first time, when we're starting a new project, we'll go through a process of asking, questions so we get to understand the firm better, and the way they work with their clients. And one of the most common things we hear is, oh, we're people, we're approachable, we're friendly. So you want that to be reflected in your content. And that's not always going to be the case if, the content lacks any kind of personality.
So, I think at Conscious, we have been experimenting with AI for a little while now. I think it's fair to say it's still sort of fairly early days for us, as it is for everyone. ChatGPT obviously is the thing that I think has really kicked off for most people looking more at AI, and it's only been around for a few months. But we have been trialing a few different programs. Main ones are ChatGPT, WriteSonic, and Jasper AI, which we will talk about a little bit more. And basically what we're trying to discover at the moment is, which tools we think work the best, and understand, going back to some of the stuff we talked about earlier, like, what do we need to put in to get out the best possible results, and what will we then need to do with what it's produced to make it something that is going to be effective for our clients. And that is obviously a really big question for us, because what we would never want to do is start just producing loads of AI content and shoving it on clients' websites without being really confident that it was going to generate results for them. So we are embracing it, but we're taking, I would say, a sort of reasonably cautious approach of wanting to be really sure that it's going to get good results for our clients. And I think for us, we see it as something that is going to kind of fit in with our existing processes. It's going to automate some of what we're already doing, rather than necessarily radically changing straight away the way we work. And maybe over time, as these tools develop, as we all get better at using them, maybe there will be more radical changes. But I think we're seeing it as something to use kind of research and planning, and maybe generating some snippets of information, such as answering FAQs. But we're not at the moment looking at kind of wholesale getting it to write content for us, because at the moment, we don't think it's there to be able to kind of do that in a way that I think we would be kind of happy with the results. And so I think it's, yeah, we're still kind of at the experimentation stage of working out how to use it most effectively.
I'm slightly conscious of time, so I'll go over this as briefly as possible, but sort of based on the way we started to use AI, and this is sort of our implementation and Maddie's on her side of things. We've got a few sort of tips on the best way to use prompts to sort of generate content that is, you know, as effective as possible. It's quite a simple tip, but it's quite important to remember. You need to try and include as much information as possible in your prompts, because it's very easy to just assume that AI can generate something for you that's going to be really effective by just a simple one-line sentence saying, you know, produce a blog on top tips for making a will, because there's a lot of things it won't understand and it won't be able to provide you just based on a really simple prompt. So it's not going to understand your business in any way. It's not going to understand your target audience. So that's something you need to provide for it. So you can, in a prompt, say that you want to target, your X audience, and you can then sort of adjust it to be around your intended goals. So you can say that you want to produce an informational blog, or you can say, a blog. You can give it a prompt that asks it to generate some sort of call to action, or to pick up the phone or sell a service. So you always need to remember when you're writing a prompt to keep your intended goals in mind and always your target audience. It's important to remember with ChatGPT, especially as an example, there are things in place to help you adjust the formality and the tone of voice in the answers it provides. How effective this is kind of up for debate, because it may go too far on one end or the other end of the scale, because I know it's something we find when we're writing content ourselves. One of the most important things is that balance between, being authoritative in the way you're writing, but also appealing to a broad target audience. I think what we would say is probably the most important thing to remember is, once you have a prompt and it's given you a piece of content that you want to work off of, that's not going to be the final prompt you want to use, because you can always adjust it and always keep tweaking it to provide you a more accurate piece of content. So it's important to remember the first result that you generate is unlikely to ever be your final one. You can keep going back and refining it, making little adjustments, and you have as many goes as you want to basically generate the content you have in mind. And as we discussed earlier, it's best not to use sensitive data. So with that example that Ed used about generating case studies, potentially, we wouldn't ever feel comfortable including anything that we would consider to be sensitive in a prompt, because it does store data. What it uses that data for, not clear, but the fact is it will be out there if you use it in a prompt. So that's something we would advise against.
As Ed mentioned, we are trialing 3 tools at Conscious, so ChatGPT, WriteSonic and Jasper AI. I'm just going to run really, really quickly through the benefits and drawbacks that I found of each one. So I've been using this for Conscious marketing. So we have used it for ideas generation when it comes to sort of blog post topics, some social media captions, blog posts, but we've not used any of the first drafts that have come from AI. So first of all, ChatGPT, initially I thought it was a very simple and easy to use platform. It's probably the best free tool in my opinion, but it's limited, and if you are putting in those one-liner prompts, write me a blog post on X, what it comes back with, in my opinion, does look very robotic. If all 20 of us on this call typed in, why should a digital marketing agency be used to help law firms become more successful online, we're all probably going to come back with very similar content, even though it will say it's not duplicated. The way it lays it out and the way it words things will be very similar. And I think people are very skeptical with content at the moment. So if you don't make any changes, it is going to look like it's been written by AI. So I think that's something to bear in mind. And the content I've been getting back from ChatGPT, we've had to change a lot of it to make it more personal and more in the tone of voice of conscious. But I did attend a really interesting webinar yesterday from somebody called Heather Murray on the prompts with ChatGPT. So the tools that Writesonic and Jasper AI have, you can actually do on ChatGPT, but it doesn't prompt you in the way that the other tools do. So you can ask it different things. As Joe said, you can change the formality with a thing called temperature from 0 to 1. So by changing those things and having a play around, you can get better content. But I think ChatGPT is less easy to use in that sense because it doesn't prompt you for this information. So that leads me on to Writesonic, which is the tool that I've been using most at Conscious. And from first glance, I was very overwhelmed. Compared to ChatGPT, it's got so many different things. You know, it's got 14 options for writing an article and a blog. You can write a 1,500 word blog post. You can write a 2,500 word blog post. You can write an introduction and a conclusion separately. It's got so many different tools that it was like, where the hell do I start with this, basically? I've been having a massive play around, and I do actually like it as a piece of software. As I said, it gives you options for putting in the prompts. So I want you to use or refer back to these 10 articles. So that way you can put in more up-to-date information because you're telling it what information to look at. But it does use the same OpenAI, which is what ChatGPT uses. So in terms of its learning, it's only up to September 2021. So you've, as Joe said, you are putting in the time and effort yourself to give it these accurate prompts, finding the articles that you want it to reference so it's more up to date. But it does obviously prompt you for these things, which is really helpful, and it's a bit more user-friendly in my opinion. Writesonic is $49 a month. You probably can get it cheaper if you pay annually, but at the moment, like I said, we're just very much trialing these 3 pieces of software. I'm not recommending any of these to you at this time. I think it very much depends on what you want to use AI to do, because Writesonic, for example, it's got the articles, but you can also do images, and David's used AI to create videos and things like that. So it very much depends on what your law firm wants to use it for. And so then Jasper AI is the final tool that we've been using here at Conscious. And the one good thing, or not the one good thing, but something about Jasper AI, which is different to the others, is that it doesn't just use OpenAI software. So it also uses NeoX, T5, and Bloom. I don't really know what any of those mean, but it's drawing information from different places. So potentially the information could be more reliable. It could differentiate from Writesonic and ChatGPT, which are pulling all of the information from OpenAI. Again, it's something that you will need to play around with yourself to see if it's pulling through any more reliable content than the other softwares. Jasper AI, you can get a 7-day free trial, but in general, I found it a really difficult tool to use. To start with, it took me about 10 minutes to get to the login page because it keeps trying to make you sign up each time. I know a couple of people before said that they were using Jasper AI, so if anyone else has any further experience on that, please put it in the chat. But yeah, for me, it was my least favorite tool. ChatGPT is the best free tool. I'm sure you've all used it, so that's just my opinions on the 3 tools that we've been using. Somebody in the chat asked about Lumens 5. So that's not a tool that we've been using, but I don't know if anyone can put something in the chat if they've come across this software. Is it specifically for law firms? I'm not sure. So yeah, that's just my opinion on the 3 tools that we've been using. I would definitely say sign up for as many free trials as you can, test them out, give it the same prompts, but it's all about, in my opinion, working on your prompts, because initially I did think ChatGPT wasn't producing the best level of content, but on further playing around after the webinar I attended on prompt engineering yesterday, I think it definitely, it definitely can be a better tool than if you're just giving it a one-liner. So Lumens 5 is not specifically for law firms, but it can turn blogs into reels, apparently. Don't ask me how. I mean, I'd be interested to give that a try, because reels is something that we're really focusing on this year. But yeah, again, I think one of the biggest benefits of reels is that it's normally people content with captions put over it. So I'd be interested to see what people content it's coming up with and how it's coming up with that, if it's AI generated, because I do think the personal touch with reels is really important, so it being your staff. But yeah, anyway, let's move on to the next slide. We've got a couple of questions, but we'll come back to them once we've ran through this example from Joe.
I think I might be talking about this one.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Sorry. So this is just an example I produced, and this was using ChatGPT, and this was deliberately just using a very basic prompt. So hoping you can all read that, but the prompt is to write a 750-word blog explaining why people should make a will, and I specify using only sources from the UK. And so I think, general thoughts are that it's fine. Like it's produced a sort of basic blog, sort of, the correct information, I think, for, something, again, really basic. But, there are some issues with it. I think, if you had no idea what to write for this, it might be a good starting point to get you kind of thinking about the key points. It might give you something to edit, but I don't think that it's something that you would want to stick up on your website. Yeah, it does broadly answer the question. The language reasonably accessible, sort of competently structured. It's broken down with subheadings, short paragraphs that I talked about earlier. The structure is pretty logical. There's a point per section. The information is specific to the UK, and it is legally accurate. I mean, there's sort of minimal legal content in there, really. It's more talking about, you want to think about protecting your children. So it's kind of relatively safe from a legal point of view, I would say.
But sort of as Ed said, there's a lot to improve on just based on that. And, we're taking this with a pinch of salt, because obviously the prompt wasn't the most, effective prompt you could possibly use. But this is just an example of, if you use the prompt that was a bit, lacking in content and context, you're going to have something that's just not, particularly fit for purpose. So it's rather generic. All the tips in there are tips you would find on any other blog about the same sort of topic. There isn't really anything extra, any extra value. There isn't any kind of specific tone of voice. It's just very informational, and there's no real personality to the actual text. You may have, if you were reading through it, you may have picked up on a couple of things. I know we flicked through it quite quickly, but there's some repeated phrases. So the exact phrase "wishes are respected," I think, was repeated about 3 or 4 times, which is, a bit of an issue. We don't really want to be writing the same phrase over and over. Although we did give the prompt that we wanted to use UK sources, it did use American spelling throughout. Very minor issue, but one that it bugs me and Ed, I think we could say. So obviously, for example, it used recognize with a Z. This is probably to do with the prompt, but it just stops mid-sentence due to the word limit that Ed, put in for 750 words. So if that was, the actual length you wanted, you would have to make some adjustments to make it fit within that. It doesn't actually adjust, the content to fit within that. It provided some strange references at some points which weren't really needed, and it didn't really add any kind of value. And even when it did reference things, it didn't actually link to those references. And as we sort of said, doesn't really add any kind of tangible value. It was just a blog that gave you some tips, and that was it. Didn't give you any kind of prompt to speak to a solicitor about writing a will or amending a will. So it was a blog that would probably just get lost in the ether if it were to get uploaded.
Yeah, and I think as Joe says, it's unlikely to be effective because it's not going to make someone think, oh, this is the firm I want to get in touch with, because it's so generic that it doesn't really tell them anything about you. And so I think that is really important to think about.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was just replying to a couple of questions in the chat. So I'm just going to run through some other questions that were submitted beforehand. So somebody made the interesting and maybe quite right assumption that, does generating AI make us lazy or savvy? So we'd be interested to hear what you think, and feel free to come off mute and have a chat with us, or put your thoughts in the chat if you would prefer to stay silent. Remember, this is being recorded. But Laura, yeah.
Oh, that was quick. It wasn't actually related to that, but it's something that Ed mentioned earlier. I don't know if this was purely for chat or for all the AI, but about them drawing data from September 2021. Could you just go over that point again, please?
Yeah, so I think this is for anything that's using OpenAI. It was trained on various sources that the developers picked, and I think this was done in September 2021, or at least that was when they kind of archived a bunch of sources. So it's not pulling from the internet right now, it's pulling from this database of articles that were picked in September 2021. So that's the only information it has, is what's contained in those articles from that time. So anything that's been published since September 2021, it doesn't have access to that information. I think, as I say, I'm pretty sure that is for OpenAI rather than ChatGPT specifically. And so any tool which uses OpenAI, which is, I think, Maddie, it's right, Sonic uses it, but the other one doesn't, is that right?
Jasper AI does, but it's also using 3 other bodies, softwares of information too. But it might be that they stopped, data from September 2021 as well. So it could all be the same, but it's something that's worth looking into if you're choosing a specific software or tool for your firm.
Yeah, and unless they're pulling from the internet in real time, which I think at the moment would not be possible because it would be too slow. Even if the content is more up to date than for September 2021, it's still going to just stop at a certain point. And presumably at some point, OpenAI will be updated with more recent information. But again, it's just going to be at whatever point they have put the information in again. I think the kind of power that would be needed to pull from the live internet is so vast that they'll probably get there eventually, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, and I think that brings up issues itself, doesn't it? Because anyone can post anything on the internet, so you wouldn't necessarily want it pulling information from anywhere.
That's true. I guess how it would go about filtering out certain stuff, I don't know, because like we said, it uses Wikipedia as an example, and obviously, as everyone knows, anyone can edit Wikipedia within reason. So then you run the risk of it, if you were generating something really quickly and live, it could pull something that you really don't want. So,
and they'll also get a point where so much content on the internet is AI generated that it would just potentially pulling from other AI generated content and just reading itself. So
and then it's a cycle round and round, basically.
So I'm conscious that we have hit the time limit. We do have a couple of other questions which we will go into now, but if you need to head off, that's completely fine. Thank you very much for attending this afternoon's session. One of the other questions
Sorry, could I pick up on the lazy savvy question? Because I'm not sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think, is it lazy or savvy to use AI? I think potentially both. I think it depends how you use it. I think if you use it lazily, i.e., the example we've just given, you just put in a really basic prompt and go, oh, that'll do, and stick that on your website. I think that is lazy, and I think that's not going to work for you. But I think it is savvy to use it because it can potentially speed up what you're doing, make you more efficient, and everyone else is going to be doing it. So I think it's potentially both. Depends how lazy or savvy you are about using it, because it's, at the end of the day, it's a tool.
Yeah, I agree with that. And the webinar I attended yesterday, she made the point that AI isn't going to steal anyone's jobs, but somebody using AI properly and effectively quite possibly will. And I think that is a really good point, and something that I think Joe and Ed, you both mentioned earlier. If you're not using it, one of your competitors will be, and you very much might fall behind. So yeah, I think I agree with what you've said there, Ed. So yeah, one of the other questions we had was, how can we use AI efficiently and protect against duplicate content? And I think you've both covered points, but I don't know if you can just quickly sum up the ways to avoid content being duplicated, and that is having a human to look over it.
Yeah, and I think you've got to use some kind of anti-plagiarism tool.
Yeah,
I think that's, and there are different ones. I think Grammarly and is it Copyscape? Is that what it's called? Have I made that up? It's not one we use, but yeah, I think
we'll follow up with those in the email. But yeah, Grammarly is the tool that I've used. I'm not sure about the other.
Grammarly is the one that I use. I think Copyscape is the other big one. But yeah, you have to use some kind of anti-plagiarism tool.
Yeah. It's good practice to use it anyway. There's occasions if you're writing a blog and you're using different sources anyway as your inspiration, it's always worth just doing a plagiarism check just to be safe. But yeah, like I said, especially with AI content, it's pretty essential, to be honest.
So the final question we were asked beforehand was, we've been approached by AI legal content suppliers, interested to know more. Are they useful? What are the realistic costs, pros and cons, etc.? So that's not really something that we have experience with at Conscious. We do everything internally, whether that's using AI or not. So I don't know if anyone else on the call has experience of being either approached by one of these people and have found out their costs. But I don't know if Ed and Joe, you can go into some pros and cons.
I mean, I think my thought about that is, again, it depends who's offering the service, because as I think we've talked about, I think the key thing is that you need someone driving the AI who actually understands content and understands your firm, and ideally understands the legal sector. So I think if you've got a AI content supplier who can offer that, then great. But I think you're going to see a lot of people springing up just saying that they can do it and just probably producing a load of rubbish, much in the same way as you kind of get that in the SEO industry. I think a little bit less these days than when it first started out, but you get a lot of people who will just be like, oh yeah, we'll write some SEO content for you, and then it's just doesn't work because it's terrible.
I guess you run the risk of, because it's like the new shiny thing, isn't it, AI, that a lot of people will just be trying to use that opportunity to, like you say, just offer a service that isn't up to scratch. So it's definitely down to the actual company and the way they use AI.
Yeah, so there'll be good people using it and bad people using it, and it just comes down to who that is. And in terms of cost, I think it can make delivering content cheaper, but I don't think it's going to make it dirt cheap, because you're still going to need the people, and the people are going to be what costs the money.
Yeah, I guess what you would need to do before is weigh up if you can use AI yourself and produce AI content, what that's costing you, and the resources that you're spending on it, and then you would have something to compare it with. Because, you know, you could just get a quote and just think, okay, that's great, but it might not actually line up with the services they provide.
Yeah, I think that answers the question very well. Thank you very much, both. So that's all of the questions. I don't know if anyone has any final comments, questions that they want to put in the chat, or Joe and Ed, if you want to sum it up with anything. I mean, we've ran through a lot, so I'm not sure if we can sum it up in one sentence, but
I guess for me, the sort of final thought I probably want to leave people with is that I think AI has a lot of potential for generating content kind of faster, more efficiently, and consistently. But I think, you know, as I hope we've kind of got across, you really need someone who actually understands content, who understands marketing, and who understands your firm to be in the driving seat. And whether that's someone internal, whether that's your own marketing team, or whether that's an external provider, I think that it still needs to be people who actually know what they're doing, who are using the tools.
Yeah, I think AI is only going to be as, you know, as useful and effective as you are at using it. I think that's the key, or the person who is using it. You know, it has a lot of potential, but as we've discussed, you know, there are risks to using it, so you need to be clued up and know exactly what you're doing when you're using it to get the most out of it.
yeah, and I think prompts are key, really, and playing around with those and trialing different things.
Yeah.
Somebody said they were daunted about it beforehand, but feel confident in utilizing it now. But they do prefer conscious copywriters, which of course we also prefer conscious copywriters. So our next session will be on using your website and the internet as a recruitment tool. I've put the link in the chat if you do want to book on for that session. But if it's not relevant to you, you can pass it on to somebody at your firm as well, which would be great. Thank you very much for attending this afternoon's session. A huge thanks to Ed and Joe as well. I think they've covered so much in a lot of detail. You can rewatch the session, which I think I definitely will, to run over their tips and advice again. But yeah, a huge thanks to everyone for attending. Enjoy the long bank holiday weekend when it comes.